My name is Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU. For those of you who don't know us, the Local Government Information Unit, one of the biggest and oldest independent membership bodies for local government in the UK and in the Republic of Ireland and Australia. Our job is to spread innovation and best practice, support local government with information, ideas, analysis, and networks. We're only just over a week out from the next set of local elections in a big election year. I'm not quite sure of these figures, but I think we have more people going to the polls across the world this year than in any previous year, or very close to it. There are elections everywhere this year. It's a big election year. But first up are local elections in the UK, in England at least, which risk, as always, being slightly overshadowed by the bigger political context, but which we at LGIU think are perhaps the most important elections of all, because most of the things that most of us care about most days are delivered from the town hall or county hall, not from Whitehall. So actually these elections that elect people who will make big decisions in tough times are really consequential and really important. Inevitably, they will be seen to some extent as a sort of glorified opinion poll as people look ahead to a general election, but it is important to realize there's much more to them than that. So we're always keen to delve into local elections a bit. We've done some exclusive polling with Ipsos Mori, which we're going to hear about in a second, looking at what people think. What do people think about the role of the council? What do people think happens in local elections? What do people think about their local area? So we're going to hear a little bit about that. We've got three fantastic speakers for you this morning. We've got Cameron Garrett from Ipsos. We've got Dr. Hannah Bunting from Exeter. We've got Dr. Greg Stride from right here at LGIU. I'll introduce them as they come to speak. Each of them is going to do a few minutes. We'll then have a little bit of time for Q&A. It's a tight, leave you wanting more 45 minutes this morning. So we're going to crack on. And what that means is feel free as we go, drop questions in the chat. I'll try and pick them up as we get to the Q&A, and we'll try and get through as many of your questions and points as we can. Normal housekeeping, if you could keep your microphone off while the speakers are speaking, that would be great. We are recording this session and we will be publishing it afterwards, so be aware that anything you say could be viewed by the entire internet afterwards. So keep it polite, keep it respectful. I mean, talk of elections can often lead us to profanity, but let's try and avoid that as much as possible today. Enough from me. Let's crack on. Cameron Garrett is a senior researcher at Ipsos Mori. He's a mixed method researcher. He works in their politics team and their government and society team. He does a lot of political polling. He does a lot of data insights, and he's been working with us ahead of the elections to find out a little bit more about what do the public think about the role of the council, about local public services, and about who is responsible. Cameron, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction. Can I check if you can see my screen?
We can indeed.
Perfect. So, yeah, thank you. My name is Cameron Garrett. As Jonathan said, I'm a research manager at Ipsos. And you may have heard of us usually in the news around election time, talking about the political outlook on the national scale. But today, I'm very much going to be focusing on the local. And we've been pleased to be running an annual survey with the Local Government Information Unit for a couple of years now, asking the English public about local governance. And to stress, this survey, which I'm going to take you through now, is in England. It's amongst 18 to 75-year-olds, as these are the people who have locals, as England is the regions that has locals this time round. I know there are some PCC elections in Wales, but to keep it clean and trends from last year, it's just in England. So that's my boring methodology bit at the start. But over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through some of this year's findings. So, some good news. For those of you that attended last year, you'll be pleased to see that the public still recognise the role local councils play in impacting their everyday lives. So 2 in 5 say that local councils have the most impact on their everyday life out of a range of different actors and stakeholders. And they're up there at the top with people in Britain or just people in their local area, and ahead of Westminster and their local MP, etc. But particularly on impacting the quality of their local area, you've got 3 and 5 there, local councils coming out on top. So people do value local councils, and local councillors are a bit further down on a third, ahead of the national actors. And all these little numbers, the +2, +5s, -1s, these are changes from when we asked the question last year. And you'll see there basically haven't been massive changes. I think the only statistical significant one there would be people in Britain in your local area. So we're starting to warm up to people we live with, but apart from that, no massive changes. However, this contrast still exists, where whilst people recognise the value of local government, around 2 in 3 say they actually don't know very much about what they do, compared to a third who say they do know a great deal or fair amount. So when we're asking how decisions are made in your local area, a third know something, 2 in 3 say they don't, and the same for work of their local councillors. And this compares to the work of members in Parliament in Westminster, where people's claim knowledge is slightly higher. 2 in 5 say they know about the work of MPs, but still a majority say they actually don't know very much. And to put that in context, I'm always quite surprised when I see this stat about MPs, because I'm one of those sad losers who follows politics religiously, as I'm sure quite a lot of people are on this call. And obviously Westminster gets far more media attention than local councillors. So while there is that difference, I actually don't think that's going too bad, that gap for local councillors, but still obviously the public don't know that much on their claim knowledge. And then we ask people to what extent they trust a range of stakeholders and actors to act in the best interests of their local area. So here, local councillors and their local council perform better than politicians at the national level. So around 2 in 5 say they trust them a great deal or fair amount. And then you can see beneath them there, the UK government, you've only got 1 in 4 saying your local MP is slightly lower than your local council or your local councillor. So good, they're above kind of the national level, people trust them more, but I would say this isn't particularly a ringing endorsement. You've still got the majority saying that they don't trust them very much or at all. And there are groups that are better trusted on the local level, such as local business, the police and local community groups. And also what is key here is when we do look at the changes of last year. So I've just popped those numbers up, and you'll see across the board there has been a growing distrust. The public have become more wary since last year. So we have, for your local council, we've gone down 7 percentage points for saying they trust them a great deal or fair amount, and there's been slightly less shift on your local councillors, where it's gone down 3 points. But again, to stress, you're seeing that across the board more or less. Local community groups have upheld their numbers, but apart from that, nearly everyone has gone down around 4 percentage points on trust and up on distrust. And particularly the UK government at the bottom there, as I said, 1 in 5 and 7 in 10 not trusting them. And I just want to put this in context for some wider context for some longer term trends that Ipsos has. So we've been running this survey for 40 odd years, since before I was born, and we show them a list of different professions and say, do you trust them or not? And last year we did have record-breaking lows for government ministers, politicians, who were actually the lowest trusted profession out of the 40 we asked about. We had the lowest level of trust in 40 years for the police. And also we've started the local councillors trend a bit more recently, but it has dipped in recent years, and it's not the lowest we've ever had for them. So I just want to put this in context for trust is declining, and there is this sense of dissatisfaction in national politics, which is probably seeping through into local politics. You'll see there also I have put in trust in pollsters, just out of fairness. If I'm going to be mean about other people's professions, I should do the same to my own. Our trust is also going down. And I think what the point here is that trust in national politics is very low. People are very dissatisfied. In our political surveys, we've got the lowest levels of satisfaction for government we've measured in nearly 40 years as well. And I'm sure local government have their own challenges that local people can identify. When we ask them, it's overwhelmingly potholes, but there will definitely be this osmosis effect about people being grumpy with national politics and that impacting local government, even if they are doing an amazing job, I suspect. And this coincides with pessimism more widely about the quality of local services. So nearly half say the quality of services in their local area have got worse in the past 5 years, 48%. A third say they're about the same, and only 13% say they've got better in the past 5 years. There is an interesting age pattern here. So actually amongst 18 to 24s, and there's kind of a statistical dead heat here where 27% say they've got worse and 29% say they've got better. But actually, as you go up each age cohort, the percentage saying that services have got worse increases to the point where you get to 3 in 5 of 55 to 75s say that local services have got worse. And what is interesting actually is that the same figure actually doesn't change that much against the cohorts. So these are kind of direct shifts from got better to got worse between them. And again, we are seeing this pessimism in other surveys when we ask about public services more widely across the public realm. People are losing confidence that their public services are performing well. So it's not just services in your local area either. So looking at who the public blame or credit for these things, let's start with the good news. Among that admittedly small group, the 13% who say services have got better, local councillors are up there as among the most likely to be credited for improvements. So around 3 in 5 say, yeah, their local councillors are to be credited for these improvements in local services, and that's ahead of your local MP or the UK government, where it's nearer 50% for the UK government. And 1 in 4 say their local council deserves a great deal of responsibility. So good news. People who think stuff have got better do recognise the role that local councillors and their local council, and also local actors such as community groups, have been playing in improving those. However, it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So amongst those who think services have got worse, the 48%, when we ask them who they blame for services getting worse, 82% say their local council deserves some of the blame, which is more or less on par with what we're seeing for the UK government. So 83% blame the UK government. Although it is worth looking at this question more closely and how it breaks out. So when we ask them, we say, do you reckon they deserve a great deal of responsibility, a fair amount? Not very much, not at all. And it's worth looking at the great deals here because actually, whilst on an overall level, the local council and local councillors are getting a similar percentage of the blame, it's not felt as strongly as people feel that the UK government should be blamed when just looking at a great deal of responsibility. So the majority think that a great deal of responsibility lies with the UK government, and it's fewer than 2 in 5 for your local council and 3 in 10 for local councillors. So I don't want to be saying it's all great news. Obviously, that overall figure is not great, but that is interesting when you do break it down, and it is worth looking at the question in more detail. And it is interesting in some work that Ipsos has done on this as well, when we're looking at how public services can be improved in the future. People tell us they actually want all of these people to be working together to solve some of the problems. So it might not be helpful to be individualizing them out like this. But then, so what can be done? The majority say they want to know more about how decisions are taken in their local area and have more say in them. The few want to be actively involved. So only 17% say I'm not interested in it at all in how decisions are made in my local area, so long as the local council does its job, more or less unchanged since last year. Whereas we get just over 1 in 3 saying they would like to know more, but I don't want to be involved beyond that. And then you do get 1 in 4 saying I would like to have more of a say how decisions are made in my local area. So together, when you add those, you get around 3 in 5 saying they would like more information or to be more involved. And 8% say they would like to become more actively involved in how decisions are taken, and 2% already are. So you've got kind of 10% there who are kind of actively wanting to do something. So there is appetite amongst the public to become more involved. And ideally, when we ask them, they want a mix of local residents and local experts making the decisions. We said, who do you want making these decisions that impact your local area? Around 1 in 4 say local residents, over 2 in 5 say both equally, and fewer than 1 in 5 say local decision makers with expertise in these areas. And pretty consistently across the demographics here, you can see people want both equally. So they want people to be working together and collaborating, but definitely for local residents to be having a voice. And then more broadly, there is support for local decision making, particularly amongst older groups. So when we ask people, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statement that too many policy decisions affecting my local area are made outside it, we get the majority, 54% agreeing with that. And again, there is an age gradient with each age cohort tending to be more likely to agree the older you get that too many decisions are made outside of it. So there's this appetite for local decision making and centralizing decision to your local area. But then when we ask the statement, it does not matter who make decisions in my local area as long as they are the correct decisions, we see that outcomes are also key. So we've got a similar amount, a majority saying they agree with that, and also the same age gradient. So there is this desire for policy decisions to be made in my local area, but they also are still prioritizing outcomes and making sure that the right decisions are being made. And then just lastly in the survey, because it's been in the news recently over the past year or so, we've asked people about the section 114 notices about local councils effectively becoming bankrupt. We asked people how much they've heard about this just at the end to see, gauge interest in the story and how much awareness it's going to be. And when we asked them basically how much do you know about this, we see 3 in 5 overall claim to have heard about section 114 notices becoming bankrupt, but basically detailed knowledge is very low. So you can divide that by 3 and only 22% say they know a great deal or fair amount about these notices. As with more or less every survey we do where we ask questions about this, where we ask people to say how much they know, men claim to know more than women because men are keener to claim knowledge over women because surely there's nothing they don't know about. So here you can see men claim to know slightly more than women. There's not that many regional differences. In London, it's slightly higher. But even amongst those who say they have a knowledge of local decision making, it's only 40% who claim that they have a great deal of knowledge about these notices. So to summarise, the public clearly recognise the role of local councillors and the role councillors play locally. They trust them, particularly more than central government, but that trust has been declining. And awareness of what they do is limited, though people are somewhat unconcerned with that. This kind of lack of trust and feeling that local services are getting worse is kind of reflective of the national mood being gloomy that we're seeing in wider polling. And there's a double-edged sword for local councils and councillors. They are credited with both things getting better, but also things getting worse, although they do blame the government more. And whilst there is support for local decision making, outcomes are still seen as key amongst the public. So that's me and the findings from this year's survey.
Cameron, thank you so much. That's really interesting stuff. And, you know, it's like, as always, as you said, slightly double-edged. I think, you know, lots there that one could feel gloomy about, but also I think some grounds to think that if we are going to rebuild trust in politics, that local politics, local councils are where we need to start doing it, because we are more trusted and because people see the difference that councils make. Loads we could talk about. I'm not allowed to. I have to keep us cracking on. Next up, Dr. Hannah Bunting. Hannah's a lecturer in quantitative British politics at the University of Exeter. She's got expertise in British elections, in parties, party systems, gender, political trust, all sorts of things. And you may well have seen her on Sky News, on BBC, on ITV television, or if you're further afield, on ABC or France 24, because she's often on those channels sort of explaining complex things in terms that the rest of us can get our heads around. So it's great to have Hannah with us today. Hannah, over to you.
Okay, this worked first time when we did the practice. Okay, there we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, great.
Yeah, you can see that fine.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'd like to talk about something a little bit broader than just these 2024 local elections, but sort of using them as an anchor. And that's this topic of gender and politics, specifically around local councillors. So we know that women have and continue to be underrepresented in political offices. So at the moment, I think the proportion of MPs that are women is 35%, And the election centre data shows that of the 2023 local elections, 37% of local councillors are women. I think the LGIU survey in 2022 had this figure at 41%, but there's definitely still some inequality there. Research from the Fawcett Society and Democracy Club says that it's going to be 2051 before we're at that 50-50 between the two sexes. So to explain this difference, it's been suggested that citizens prefer masculine traits in their leaders, right? And things like decisiveness, independence, strength, they tend to be both associated with masculinity and with leadership positions and politicians. But recently we've seen some experimental evidence to show that women are actually preferred to men as candidates. So when you take all else being equal, this is sort of an experiment run by researchers, that actually citizens, respondents in that experiment say that they would prefer to elect women than men. Now, this could be because we've sort of trialed some strongman leadership recently, right? Those are the things that tend to be associated with populist movements, and they also have more sort of masculine traits. And so now that those have been trialed, naming no names, of course, perhaps people have been put off that style of leadership, right? So it's a bit of a bounce away from that kind of masculinity. And generally people tend to be dissatisfied, as we've just seen in some of those trust figures, with the combative style of politics that those masculine traits tend to bring. But what those experiments show, and what I mean by experiments here, is that researchers have taken people either in a survey, like that one that was run by Ipsos, and they've shown different groups, different things in that survey, and then looked at the differences between the answers, or they might have brought them into a lab kind of situation, and you could do really cool things by tracking people's eye movements and all that kind of thing to see what they are paying attention to. But those experiments, they are not in the real world, right? They're in a strange setting. It's either in a survey or in a lab or something like that. So what they show is that people prefer hypothetical women, but not necessarily real women when those women are on the ballot paper. So I'm doing some work with Dr. Jess Smith, who's at the University of Edinburgh at the moment, to try and synthesize the evidence we have about gender and representation. So it's something I'm really interested in. And the data I have to show you today looks at where women are successful in local government elections. So this first graph here is these are winning candidates over sort of a nearly 50-year period. Unfortunately, 2023 isn't on there, but it's pretty much the same as 2022. And you have women there in blue and men in orange. So you can see that across those 50 years, the proportion of women who win, who are elected, has tripled. It starts off at, just over 10%, and we're now, well into the 30s. So, it's definitely been getting better, but there is still that gap between that blue and orange bar. So the next few graphs are going to sort of break this down by types of councils and then by party to see where this difference is really kind of coming from. So here we have London boroughs, and you can see, especially in 2022, right, that gap between the orange and blue bar is much smaller than it was when we looked at all councils, the average. So it's only around a 10% difference, 10% more men. And there are actually 9 London boroughs where there are more women councillors than there are men, which I think is really interesting. And I'd love to go and interview some of those councillors or some of those, local governments. If we look at also, more built up urban areas, these metropolitan boroughs, the gap gets a little bit bigger, but it's still not as big as when we look at it overall, right? So the representation of women is slightly better in these, these metropolitan boroughs, right? And you can see that the trajectory as well actually has been a lot better. It's been improved quite a lot. But here, once we start to look at district councils and thirds, it gets bigger again, right? So they tend to be less urban areas, right? And yeah, we can see that this gap starts to emerge. I'm not going to go too much into the exact kind of figures because of time, but you can see as we go through these graphs that gap between blue and orange is getting bigger. The worst performance in terms of gender parity is in the Shire counties. So here it falls below 30%, which when you look on average, it hasn't been that in sort of 15 years, right? When you take all of the averages together. In 2021, there were 7 Shire counties where it was under 25% that were elected women. So that means that 3/4 of the councillors that were elected were men. So the last graph I have to show you separates this by party. It's a little bit smaller, but really what all you need to pay attention to is that difference between the blue and orange bar. So at the bottom, we can see that Labour have pretty much achieved gender equality, right? There's hardly any difference between those two colours there. And as I say, 2023 is pretty similar to that. Whereas the Conservatives at the top, it's a sizable gap. Right? Not shown here is actually the Liberal Democrats, and they are between 30 and 40%. So they're pretty much on average, compared to the benchmark of all councils. So how can we explain this? First, progressive parties, so those on the left, Labour, Liberal Democrats, Green parties, they might align more with feminine traits than masculine traits. So there might be more space for women to stand and therefore for women to win. Of course, Labour have enforced all women shortlists. So that means that a woman would definitely be selected for that seat. And then if she won, woman would definitely be elected. Not everybody agrees with those sort of initiatives, but they have definitely worked, right? And you can kind of see that here. It's also a combination of where parties stand, right? And where parties are successful. So in the Shires, that tends to be the Conservative heartlands, right? Where they have a bit more of a problem with this. And those urban areas are kind of Labour's backyard, talking in sweeping terms here. But if we come full circle on this story, okay, so that experimental evidence, if that is correct, if citizens are keen to elect women, perhaps more so than they are men, then that kind of takes care of what we call the demand side problem, right? So it's long been debated is whether women's representation is a demand side, so citizens just don't want to elect women, or is it a supply side? We need to get more women into politics and get them to stand. So if the experimental evidence is correct, then that kind of demand side is taken care of. And so we can start to achieve that balance by addressing the supply side. So things like remuneration rates, this research hasn't been done since 2018, that sort of yellowy graph there that you can see on one side. Because it's really difficult to kind of gather information on the differences in how much councillors are paid across the country. But we know that it does differ wildly. There's also things like travel and access. So you have to attend council meetings as a councillor. If you are in a rural area and it's more difficult to get to that council, either because public transport isn't great or it just happens to be further away from where you live, then that might impact gender parity as well. And also balancing caring responsibilities. So we know that normally falls to women or disproportionately falls to women. And how can you balance that with councillor duties? So one thing I'll be looking for in these 2024 local elections is whether the number and proportion of women standing and winning increases. So do we still see that increased trajectory? Does it jump up quite considerably? What's going to sort of happen there? And what this might tell us about styles of representation going forward, right? So, of course, not all men have masculine leadership styles and not all women have feminine leadership styles. But in an already less combative and more collaborative arena that is local government, it might be the perfect sort of area for a mini revolution in representation equality. I think local government really is the bottom-up kind of engine of change. So it would not surprise me at all if this is another area where it's successful. And that is me for today.
Hannah, thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And again, I think, with my relentlessly optimistic hat on, shows how local government, as you said at the end, is a crucible for progress, can be the place in which we really sort of move forward on so many of these key issues. Right, last but by no means least, our very own Dr. Greg Stride, who's a researcher here at LGIU in our Local Democracy Research Centre, where he's led projects on local government finance and, particularly relevant today, electoral administration. Before joining us, he did his PhD also at the University of Exeter, where he also taught social science research methods. I don't have time to go into all the things that Greg is expert in. I will just hand over to him. Greg.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to Cameron and Hannah for two really interesting topics. I'm only going to talk for about 4 minutes, which is good because I only have 4 things to say. I want to talk about elections as a logistical exercise, so the organization of elections, which is a thing that really sticks in my mind, especially as we go into this year. So the first thing I want to say is that 2024 is going to be undeniably a huge year for elections. So as Jonathan spoke about at the beginning of this presentation, it's a huge year for elections globally. Roughly half the world's population, apparently, although I've not done these calculations myself, will be given the opportunity to vote, which is extraordinary and has never happened before. In the UK, we have only 107 different councils that are having elections this year, which is very few compared to the 230 last year. But on top of that, we have police and crime commissioner elections or mayoral combined authority elections in every single electoral district in England and Wales. And what that boils down to is that every electoral administrator around the entire country will have to organize at least 1 election. Some of them will be organizing 2 elections, some of them 3 elections. I don't know how high it gets, but I mean, 3 elections seems like enough, doesn't it? Then you've got coming later this year, the general election, which could happen at any moment, which is a peculiarity of the English system, of the UK system, I should say. And it does mean that things are really, really difficult for electoral administrators who have to be on high alert at all times to organize this most complicated electoral. Well, I mean, it's not the most complicated, but it's the one that people are most interested in, the electoral process of a general election. So that's the first thing I want to say. It's a huge year for elections. The second thing is that elections are changing, and all change makes things more complex. So we had the introduction of voter identification last year that I spoke about absolutely endlessly, and we have reports on that you can go and read. Voter identification has changed the way elections look to members of the public, as has the change of an electoral system. So for mayoral combined authorities and for police and crime commissioners, it used to be that you would get 2 preferences, you get a first and second preference. Now we're over to first past the post, which is the same as we use for general elections, but it does at least mean that there's been another change. Then there's also changes happening behind the scenes. So you have things like the introduction of online absent vote applications. It used to be if you wanted a postal vote, you had to write in to get one, but now you can do it all online, which is a good change, but it's also another change, which makes things more complicated for the people whose job it is to actually make these things happen. Then you have new ballot secrecy requirements that are coming in at the same time. You also have, for the next general election, things like the extension of the franchise to overseas electors for longer. I mean, things are changing at an absolutely frightening pace, and that's coming on top of a bucket of electoral legislation that pretty much everybody who's ever looked at it agrees is too complicated. Too complicated for the people whose job it is to run elections, way too complicated for voters. It's a really difficult and complicated system. The third thing that I want to say is that this huge year and the changing elections are combining to stress test a system that is already under significant strain. So we all agree that elections are part of the critical infrastructure of the United Kingdom. They are the bedrock of our entire system of representative democracy. They have to work. And the issue is that lots of electoral administrators, the people I've been talking about whose job it is to make elections happen, are worried that the electoral processes are not indestructible. In fact, they're in a state of quite serious pressure. So, for example, last year, 88% of staff that we surveyed in the June of last year said that recruiting polling station staff was becoming a problem. This is a problem that is likely to get worse the more elections there are going on, because it means you can't poach staff from other areas, and you need polling station staff to make elections happen. So it's one of those things that's going to get continually more and more complicated. Even more frighteningly, 93% last year said that organizing a snap election was a problem for them. And that's exactly what they're going to have to do this year. I mean, pretty much nobody is hopeful that they'll get a long time to plan this election. It's likely to happen as and when it looks politically like a good idea. So for the Prime Minister. The final thing that I want to say is, because I've run out of time already, is thank you to those people whose job it is to make it happen. So far in England and Wales, the UK in general, no election has what you might call failed, or what an academic might call election failure. There's not been large-scale rejection of the results, for example. But this is only, in my view, having studied this for many, many years now, due to the hard work and dedication of the election staff working in local councils who make sure that this happens, often at great personal cost, often under extreme stress. And I just finally want to say, if what I've been saying all this time about this being another critical test for elections comes to pass, the things you want to look out for are small-scale failures. Things like people not getting their voter authority certificates, or not getting registered in time, or not nominated in time, that sort of thing, small scale stuff, not receiving their postal votes. If anything goes really wrong, you will hear about it, because that's the sort of thing that national media is interested in, is election failure. And also I'd look out for our research, because we're planning on doing this research for, again, the same thing that we did last year. We're planning on doing again for these local elections and for the general elections this year. So I've well and truly run out of time, but thank you all. I look forward to the Q&A.
Greg, thank you. That all challenges my relentless optimism a bit, quite. And I think it is that the central point that, you know, as a citizen, we quite rightly take elections for granted, but they're very complicated and they rely on a lot of people getting a lot of things right under a lot of pressure, and we shouldn't forget that. Look, we've got a few minutes, just a few minutes for Q&A. We've got one question coming in on the chat from Anna, who is saying, look, if most people want to know more about how decisions are made, as we saw, and some people want to be more actively involved, but at the same time, people are generally don't trust the council and trust is going down, how do we get, and I guess the we here refers to local government, how do we get buy-in both to the information we put out, and how do we get people to trust that their input will be acted on? Do we need to rely more on or work more closely with community groups because they are more trusted? I guess my addition to that, or do we then risk dragging their trust down? Where shall we start? Let's just sort of fairly randomly, we'll go take a quick view from everyone on that. Hannah, and then Cameron on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it's yeah, a paradox almost, isn't it? Because people want to be involved, but actually I don't trust you, so maybe I don't necessarily want to be involved. I think getting community group buy-in and having a bit of kind of diffusion of accountability. So we see this in some of my work in trust. We see this in conflict areas. So perhaps in Ireland or, somewhere like that. If you can get community leaders involved to kind of diffuse the information and kind of diffuse the trust, by diffuse, I just mean spread, essentially, then that can really be a stepping stone to help build these relationships. So I think that would be an excellent kind of strategy. I do also think that I really liked that graph that you showed, Cameron, because it's almost like if you join a local Facebook group, that's kind of like the distribution of people who and how involved they are. So I think there's probably, you can rely on a couple of key actors, basically, that you can then go and spread your message. So that might be community groups, or that might be, other types of community leaders.
Yeah, I think that's really important, using those key influencers, but also being aware of their limitations and the edges of their networks. Cameron, very quickly on this, because we've got loads of questions coming in.
Yeah, just very quickly. I think the public always like collaboration between different actors in your local area. When we ask them, they want to see people working together. So the more you can do that and show you are doing that, and that doesn't necessarily have to just be with the local community groups, amongst different bodies and public services. Don't work in silos, work together. And that's generally is what people are telling us they want to see, standing up for people in their local area and being a voice of that. And you might not drag their trust down. Come on, Jonathan, have some of your
you're right. I was just getting, yes, I should focus on my relentless optimism. We will boost our own trust by working with people who are who are more trusted. Brian in the chat making the very good point that procedural rather than outcomes fairness is critical to trust. It's about, you know, showing you're working, how you do things, and doing things as you said they were, because you can't outcomes. Very quick question specifically to Hannah: would proxy or remote voting help women in local government, balancing childcare, etc., etc.?
Definitely, yeah. I think during the pandemic, I think there's some realization that actually those changes in working practices and making some things remote or proxy, and having to adapt to those extreme circumstances, we can take some of that forward into sort of a post-pandemic return to normal, whatever that might be. And yeah, that definitely would help, but it's about making sure that it's also secure. I think that's where the conflict comes in, is that people think that might be then open to vulnerability. But yes, definitely is a quick response.
And then a second question from Katie about did you, I don't know if this is you, Hannah, or you, Cameron, or anyone, any research on how national politics affects local political outcomes? And this is a really good point, because it's easy for people like LGIU to say it's about the local, but of course, national politics impacts on it. So how does, you know, are we able to quantify that impact in any way?
In terms of election outcomes, then yeah, definitely you will see a lot of Conservative councillors at the moment trying to step away from the Conservative brand a little bit and have more of an incumbent vote. So definitely in terms of those perceptions, but it usually the most motivated voters who turn out in these local elections. So they tend to know more about their local candidates or their local councils. So they might not be as affected in terms of elections, but because, as we saw in some of that research that Cameron showed us, there is that misunderstanding between what is a local issue and what is a national issue. That there can be some blame or accountability, whichever way it goes, attributed to the wrong actor.
Yeah, it's not an absolute distinction. Cameron, have Ipsos done anything on this that?
Not that immediately springs to mind, but obviously the national politics will affect the local in terms of the outcome, and also some of the decisions that are being made, whether they're getting funding for it, etc. But some of that procedural stuff, local people won't necessarily know how that works out. So when they're blaming, they will still very much look and be like, my local area isn't improved, who do I blame?
So that's complex. Greg, quick one for you. Rise in populism, polarization, echo chambers, conspiracy theorists. Yeah, we're familiar with this. Is there a risk that we could see contested election outcomes in our system in the way that we've seen in the US presidential elections?
Yeah, I think that this has hit on the primary risk that we have for our electoral processes, which is that an administrative failure of any scale, which may or may not actually affect the results of an election, I think it's more likely that it won't, is capitalized on by groups who, or at least has the result of confidence in elections being decreased. And I think confidence in elections is actually much shakier, public confidence in elections, as we've seen in the US, is much shakier than the structure of electoral administration, which is generally pretty sound, apart from being under such intense pressure. So I think confidence in elections is one of those things. It is a major risk, and it's the foundation of democratic legitimacy, that people believe that elections are free and fair.
Yeah. So an extension, Sean's question, extending on that, voter ID being used for the first time in London, Scotland, and Wales. Could close elections get contested over voters turned away? It's not so much the number of voters turned away; it's the level of sort of distrust it provokes in the system that starts to create contestation.
Yeah, especially in high salience elections. So I mean, we've not seen this tested in something like a close general election where the difference between the winner and second place is smaller than the number of voters turned away. You're looking at a pretty damaging situation where confidence could be shaken quite seriously, and that is something I'm worried about. Yes.
Okay. Greg, not helping me with my optimism.
Yeah, sorry.
My optimism quotient. Kerry, interested in Hannah's research on. It's a longer question than we really have time to deal with now, so but we can connect Kerry and Hannah afterwards. But how far are practical demands of being a councillor putting women off? And are parties selecting enough women as candidates? Does the likelihood of social media abuse put women off public life. I'm going to guess, Hannah, that your answers to those questions are yes, no, and yes. But
Pretty much, yeah. If we had to do it in sort of 10 seconds, that would definitely be it.
you
There's
do
a
have to do it in 10
huge-
seconds, I'm
Yeah,
afraid.
there's a huge literature out there that it would be impossible for me to sort of synthesize. But I think on the social media abuse, that might be something that local government can leverage for those women who do want to be politically active. They tend to not be under as much scrutiny as if you were to go to be an MP.
Yeah. Although some of the stories we're hearing from particularly women council leaders are quite frightening now. Okay, we're defeated by the clock. We're 1 minute over, so I'm not going to have time to do my sort of round up. I'm going to do it anyway. In 10 seconds to each of our panelists. Thursday night next week, as the results start coming in, what's the one thing you're most looking out for, Hannah?
The pretty much similar to last year, which would be how much of the vote goes to the two main parties, Labour and Conservative, and how much goes to other parties.
Excellent. Greg?
I've used up my time by not unmuting myself. I would say I'm looking out for, I'm always looking out for small news stories about difficulties with elections, especially about voters being turned away. But politically, and I did also contribute to the Wants to Watch guide, I'll be looking to the mayor of the West Midlands to see what happens there.
Yeah, big election, big election. Cameron?
Yeah, I think Greg and Hannah have stolen both my points, but mayorals, especially West Mids and T Valley, and then also how Reform UK poll in the locals specifically, I'm interested in from a polling perspective.
Big questions. Just over a week to go. I think one thing. Look, just in wrapping up, and I think those answers were worth overrunning for 2 minutes. I think, if nothing else, this excellent event, great speakers, demonstrates that these things matter, and there is a lot of real. Next week is going to be very interesting for lots of very real reasons, not just about what it tells us about national politics, though that too could be extremely interesting. Thank you to Hannah, thank you to Cameron, thank you to Greg. Really helpful insights. Thanks Simone and LGIU team for making it all happen, and most of all, thank you to all of you for coming this morning. I hope to see you soon. Thank you all very much.